The Wood Whisperer is sponsored by Powermatic, the gold standard since 1921, and by Rockler Woodworking and Hardware. Create with confidence.
So the whole point of what I wanted to do with this was to basically talk about my personal sharpening method, the things that I use, the tools I use. I want to show you how quick I can go from a dull chisel to a super sharp chisel and get back to work, because really that's the ultimate goal. And I want to show you the brands and the specific materials I use. I've been doing this for a while. I've been doing a lot of reviews, and I get a good opportunity to work with different materials, different tools, and there's a lot of sharpening gimmicks out there. A lot of automated things, and just 100 million ways that you could possibly put an edge on a tool. And honestly, I think they all work. Just is a matter of what you want to stick with and try to get the best results from. So having touched all these different things, I've gotten to a point where I'm pretty comfortable with my particular setup. And I could certainly do it other ways, but this is what I seem to constantly gravitate toward. And it really comes down to two primary goals for me when it comes to sharpening. And that's number one, being very quick. If it takes me a long time to do this, and I don't know if Vic is in the chat room, but he recently just made his dedicated sharpening basin, which is really, really cool if you get a chance to take a look at it. Any type of sharpening station like that, it may seem like overkill, but if you think about it, if you have a dedicated place to put your stuff out, so whenever you need to put a new edge on a chisel or a plane blade, you just run over there, set it up, boom, 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 you're back to work. That's the key to having sharp tools, is the convenience and the simplicity of your sharpening system. So that's one thing. Whatever I do, it's got to be fast and it's got to be easy. The other thing is I like to remove the least amount of stock possible. So if I'm working with, a grinder, that tends to remove a lot of stock in a hurry, and that can really, shorten the life of your tools, because you wind up taking off more material than you really need. I mean, a lot of times will get a chisel, let's say, from the factory. It comes at usually, 25 degrees? I like my chisels to have a little bit more of an angle on them, so I usually take mine to 30, sometimes 35 degrees. Well, what that means is when I start sharpening, let's say at 30 degrees, if this was sharpened at 25, I'm really going to be working heavily at the tip. So do I need to sit there and grind the heck out of it until I get the entire bevel up to my 30 degrees? No, you don't need to. All I need to do is start working at the top, and essentially I'm creating kind of like a mini bevel or a micro bevel of sorts, and eventually over time I will get back to my angle. So, working with the stones is something that really allows me to have absolute complete control. You can have control on things like the Tormek and the Jet Wet Sharpener too. What's another one? Work Sharp is really good. But for me, I just like the pleasant experience of working with stones. I think it's a very flexible system, despite the fact that it's probably one of the oldest systems. So here's a quick look at the stuff that I use. I actually do have another one of these, but these are the three that I use primarily. These are my Sharpen ceramic stones. Okay, it's basically a water stone, some sort of ceramic composite, whatever, schmutz. All right, works like a water stone. It wears a little bit better than a regular water stone in that you don't need to flatten it quite as much. And the other good thing is you're just basically gonna spray it and go. A lot of water stones need to be soaked. You have to give them like a half-hour soak before you actually start to sharpen with them. Not with a Sharpen, you just spray it and you go. So these are pretty good. Well, not pretty good, these are great. They're also very expensive. But again, if it leads to a sharpening method that allows me to get back to work fast, I don't really care how much it costs, because that means I'm gonna actually use it. If I get a bargain system that's hard to use and I never use it, did I really do myself any favors by saving money? Not really. So the grits that I have are 1,000, 5,000, and then 8,000. The 8,000 I would consider pretty optional. It's a good polishing stone. I do like to use it, but I think technically you can get away with a 1 and a 5. And if you don't want to go as far as buying Sharpen stones, you could just get yourself some regular old, Norton water stones. There's plenty of Japanese brands out there for Japanese water stones, and I think you probably should aim for something at least two surfaces. Sometimes they're two-sided, so you can get one that actually has a 1,000 and a 4,000, 1,000, 5,000. But try to get those two in those ranges. They don't have to be exactly those numbers, but I think you should at least have something in the 1,000 range and something in the 5,000 range. Now the other thing that I have in my collection is a DMT sharpening plate. The DMT plates are sort of this diamond embedded surface. It's a metal surface with diamond grit on top of it. I do use this when I need to really work a bevel that needs a lot of work because it's pretty aggressive. What do they rate this at? I think it's 120, what is it? 220. So 220 is the grit of this surface. I'll use that to rework a bevel, but my primary thing, and we'll do this at the very end, I use this to flatten my stones. If you're going to use water stones, you better think about how you're going to flatten them, because after every session, you've essentially created dips and valleys in that stone, which make it less and less effective unless you actually start to fix it. So the way you fix it is by flattening it up against a known flat surface. So that's the primary function of my DMT honing plate here. Okay, and the other thing, my other critical item in my sharpening setup is my Veritas Mk2 Honing Jig. All right, this is another thing that's not cheap. You guys would know better than me what the current price is. I think it's about like 70 bucks-ish, something like that. But this is the Mack Daddy of sharpening and honing guides. This thing is just awesome. You have the ability to set up any angle, whether it's a chisel or a plain blade. You could set up pretty much any angle you want, and the setup is really quick. You could very easily put a micro bevel on, and we'll talk a little bit about micro bevels a little bit later, but this tool just makes it super easy. They even have attachments on the roller down here. If you want to do like a cambered blade, maybe on a smoothing plane where you want to introduce a nice little curvature to the tip of that blade, you could do that with the cambered roller. That allows you to kind of rock it back and forth as you're moving it over the stone. So we should probably talk about guides, and you'll find very distinct sort of division of opinions on whether or not you should use a guide. I think most reasonable people say use whatever the heck you want, and if you want to go freehand, go freehand. There are a lot of people who have stronger opinions about which way is better. For me personally, I don't care what you use, whatever gets the job done. But for my shop, I like the honing jig because I'll put it this way. Sharpening is one of those utility skills. I want to be able to do it quickly, but I don't really think I'm ever going to go to my friends and brag about how I could do this freehand. I don't really see any, it doesn't really give me any great satisfaction necessarily to say that I could do this freehand. I mean, I've done it a lot freehand, and there are some chisels and things that won't necessarily fit in this, so you may need to use those freehand skills. But when I'm really just trying to touch up an edge and I just want to get back to work as soon as possible, I'd much rather rely on this to be accurate than to rely on my hands to be accurate. And truthfully, I don't sharpen enough to necessarily become really, really good at doing this by hand. I'd rather put my time into practicing other woodworking skills. This one is just something I feel like I can rely on and not feel bad about it. Okay, so those are the materials that I use. Let's do a real quick touch-up job on one of my chisels, and I'm going to switch the camera angle here for you. Now, the purpose of showing this is I want to show you how quickly I can get back to work with a dull chisel. Let's see. So I've got the honing jig here. I've got one of my Japanese chisels. We could talk a little bit more about the difference between a Japanese chisel and standard Western style chisel like this. But basically, I've got a dull chisel and I want to get back to work. I know the settings for this. I know exactly what I sharpened it at last time, and it shouldn't be too much trouble to pop this thing into the jig, sharpen my micro bevel, and get back to work. So let's do just that. Now on the Mk2, okay, it's going to take me a little bit longer because obviously I'm explaining as I go. It's got this little setup guide that slides on this little dovetail-y type groove, daily whacker thingy. All right, you basically have a gauge on here that allows you to determine the side-to-side location. What it does is helps you center this. If it's not centered, let's say your chisel is in here like so. Oops, let's loosen it up. If it's not centered, when you start tightening down, you could skew the blade a little bit. All right, so if I'm more over to this side and I start tightening, it becomes easier to tighten this side down because we've got more slack, and you wind up bending this bar and you could very well skew the chisel. So your best bet is to try to get it as close to center as possible, and that's what this little jig helps you do. It also has on the top it's also got a scale. And that scale helps you pick the exact angle that you're looking for, right? So I actually have a 35-degree bevel on this. In fact, it's a 35-degree bevel with a, I don't know whether it's 1 or 2 degree micro bevel, something like that. It's roughly a 1-inch chisel. So I'm going to set this guy at 1 inch, tighten it down, and I've got the stop here set at 35 degrees. All right, so I could flip it over, install the chisel. Now the idea, to keep the chisel square, you have to ride it up against this edge right here. So I'm just going to slide it up against the edge and push it forward till it makes contact with the stop. And once I'm there, I'm going to start tightening the bar down, trying to keep it even on both sides. You don't want to over tighten one side more than the other. Tightening, tightening. Your fingers will hurt after a while if you do this a number of times. Okay, so I flip it over. Now I can get a better grip, really tighten that down. And now I can remove the gauge as I rip the skin off of my fingers. Gotta love knurled knobs, right? Okay, so this guy is pretty much ready to go. Now the thing is, I do have a micro bevel on here, and this little adjustment on the side is what allows me to very quickly get an exact micro bevel. So with the little pointer up, the micro bevel is not engaged. So I want to turn it a couple clicks down so the arrow is facing down. That now means that I'm really just working the very tip of my chisel bevel there. All right, so I only want to touch up the surface. So I'm gonna pretty much just go to my 8,000 grit stone. Whoops, that's 5. I'm gonna go right to my 8. A little bit of water. It's also a good idea. Yeah, no kidding. Having pliers around with this is probably a really good idea. Just don't mangle the brass knobs. Take a Sharpie. It's a real good idea to always mark up that bevel so you know exactly when you remove the material. Okay. So let's see how we did here. Just a couple light strokes. That'll give you an idea of your progress. I don't know how well you're going to see this on the live cam. I'll try to move a couple different angles here. But you see that little 1/8 of an inch area at the tip? That is my micro bevel. That's what I'm hitting. And you notice the Sharpie marker is gone from that very tip. All right. So what I'm really looking to do when I'm touching up like this is to take a few strokes, remove that ink so I know that I'm in the right spot. And once the ink is gone, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 strokes like this. Okay, now I am at 8,000 grit. So if you've watched anyone sharpen or heard anyone talk about sharpening, you know we talk about feeling that burr. See if you could feel a burr on the back, and that's how you know the metal is right at the tip because it's being pushed up over the edge. All right, so you should be able to feel a very fine burr. At 8,000 grit, it's not going to be too substantial, but it's still there. Okay, so now that's all I need to do. Let me loosen this guy up. All right, we do want to get rid of that burr, so right back onto the 8,000 grit. Just going to address the back of the chisel. Use a very light touch. Really not putting much pressure at all. I'm pretty much letting the chisel's weight do the work here. And that's it. All I wanted to do was remove that little burr, and now this guy is razor sharp again. So subtract all the talking and explaining, this would have been maybe a 30-second procedure at best. And now this guy is ready for work. So that right there is the reason why I like this system, because I can that quickly sharpen a chisel and be back to work. Now, of course, there's a lot of preparation work that goes into making this chisel ready for this type of action. So we should probably talk a little bit about that. Let me get one of my other chisels here. Put that guy away. All right, so a lot of times, you know, a new chisel, or let's say an old chisel that's new to you, you don't necessarily know exactly what the bevel is. You first have to make that decision. What bevel angle do you want to sharpen to? And what we'll do is I've got a couple chisels here that, honestly, these are my utility chisels, I call them. You know, they got a lot of glue and stuff on them, and I kind of just sharpen them. I don't care too much about the bevel angle, because I'm just really removing glue and doing a lot of utility work. So let's pretend someone gave you a brand new chisel and you really want to get this thing, you know, sharpened up for joinery use, basically. All right, so let's sharpen that guy up from scratch for the most part. I will go pretty quickly through this process because, again, I didn't want this to be like a top to bottom sharpening explanation, just more or less, you know, the tricks that I use to get there. Okay, so bevel angles. If you are, I'm just going to keep the camera angle where it is, even though you can't see my face. How's this? What's up, baby? If you are doing paring, okay, so you've got a workpiece and you're running the chisel at a very low angle like this, and you're just kind of peeling material away, it's a paring action, you could probably get away with like 15 to 20 degrees. Okay, that's pretty fine. The drawback of something like that is it's not real durable. Okay, it's a very shallow bevel, and you wind up having a very weak spot at the very tip because there's not a lot of meat behind the tip to resist it from breaking, cracking, and things like that. So that's why you usually reserve a low angle for paring action. You go to the opposite end of the scale, let's say you're doing mortising and you have a mortising chisel. You may go as high as 40, 45 degrees because you need a lot of material to back that edge up. You don't want it to split because you're smacking on that thing with a mallet or a hammer, and that's really a lot of torture to put a chisel through. So if you are just doing your standard set of bench chisels, personal preference comes to play. I think you could, well, factory, they come at typically 25 degrees. So you could either keep it at 25 or you could step it up to 30. You can go as high as 35. I know for me, on my marbles, they tend to chip at the edge a little bit too much. So for me personally, I like to take it from their factory 25 and raise it up to 30 and sometimes 35 degrees, and that just works for me better. I value the durability more than I value the ability to pare, and I don't pare quite as often as I chop. So it's all about personal preference. So now if I received this chisel from a friend or someone else who might not be a friend, doesn't matter, and I wanted to, I mean, there are angle gauges and you could probably measure this to figure out exactly what it's at. I don't know that it's that big of a deal because I know what I want it to be. Chances are it's going to be 25-ish. All right, so what I'm going to do is set up my Mk2 here. Let me put this back down. All right, I'm going to set this guy up for, let's go for 30 degrees. Okay. Just getting everything in place. Take the micro bevel off. That's something I tend to forget to do a lot. You could always add the micro bevel later, but it really confuses things if you leave the micro bevel on and just start sharpening. Let's see. I want it to go 30 degrees, and I'm using the standard angle setting. So I will set my stop right here at 30 degrees. I'm using it's labeled as standard angles. It's the yellow setting in the middle, 30 degrees. Okay, so now I can slide this bad boy on, and I'm looking at maybe a 3/4 inch wide chisel roughly. So I'm going to set this on the scale at about 3/4. Doesn't have to be perfect. Flip it over, slide the chisel in. Once again, up against the side, push it forward till it hits the stop, and I like to sight down so that I can see if I'm tilting one way or the other. If you look here, you can kind of see if you start to go too far in one direction. I want it to be nice and even on both sides. Okay, tighten it up, tighten it up. Now I can remove the gauge. That's the one that hurts the most. It really does. All right, so new chisel. This bevel is probably in really sad shape. All right, so this is one of those times, especially when it's new to me, whether it's brand new or not is irrelevant as long as it's new to me, I'm going to give it this treatment. Oh, poo. You know what I forgot to do? Dumb me. You know what the problem is? This chisel is not new to me, so I wasn't thinking. You see this area in the back here? The light hits it just the right way. You could see that the bottom, maybe 2 inches, is a different consistency, different look than the back. That's because this has been flattened, dead flat. All right, that is number 1, numero uno. And silly me for not catching it. I'm sure I haven't been reading the chat room, and I guarantee somebody has already said that. If you have a new chisel, the very first thing you need to do is make sure that that back is flat. All right, so you're gonna, and this is something that can take a long time depending on how bad this chisel is. You're basically going to start on the lowest grit you've got, keep rubbing the edge. You don't necessarily need to go back this far. Technically, you only maybe need the bottom ½ inch or so. So depending on how you want to do it, you could hang it off the edge like this and just work the very front, 3/4, ½ inch, inch. Usually you need enough to make it stable, all right? Your goal is to create a perfectly flat back. If you don't do this, things just don't work right. All of the work that we're going to do on the bevel, looking for the burr, all of that depends on having a perfectly flat back. If you're using this for paring operations, right, you need that flat back because you're going to be referencing that off of a lot of flat surfaces. So if it's not flat, that's a problem. And if you're, chopping and you want to create nice flat walls for mortises and straight walls and things like that, you need a nice flat reference surface. So numero uno is to create a flat back, and you're basically going to take that through all of your grits, all the way on up to your highest grit, whatever it is. Polish that bad boy up. If you can, try to make it so that you can see your pretty face in it. This is now the 8,000 grit stone. All right. So what we're doing is using our imaginations to pretend that I have gone through all of the grits. And once you're at your final grit, everything looks nice and clean and consistent on that surface. Of course, feel free to use your Sharpie to make the marks so you can determine if it is. You're basically ready to go and start working on the bevel. It's a very important thing, but it's very tedious to demonstrate and to show from beginning to end, because on some chisels, it can take a long time. Incidentally, that's what makes a Japanese chisel so great, in my personal opinion, is because Japanese chisels have a little hollow, and in some cases, multiple hollows. And those hollows mean you don't have to sharpen all that material. I mean, look at the actual surface area of metal that needs to be sharpened on this one versus the Japanese style. All I need to do is make sure that that area, the perimeter, is nice and smooth and flat. All right, so just a little FYI. All right, so we are assuming that the back is flat now, and we could set up for the bevel. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Okay, now I'm going to reassemble, just like we did before, setting up for 30-degree bevel. Tighten it up. Loosen this doohickey. Right, now we are ready to roll. So now, again, new bevel, new chisel. Back is perfectly flat. I'm going to start on my lowest grit here because I just want to see what we're up against. And if you got this from a friend, chances are, unless your friend happens to be a very picky woodworker, the chisel is probably going to be mangled. And if it's brand new, it may not be the bevel angle you want, so you're going to have to contend with this no matter what. Sharpie gives me a nice black surface there, so I can determine what we're doing here. This is 220 grit, so this is fairly rough. Another reason why I like the honing guides for this type of thing is because I could really zone out while I'm doing this. I don't have to worry about absolutely paying. Don't get me wrong, that sounds bad. I pay attention, but I can have like the radio on and maybe a movie or something. Obviously, safety's sake, you want to be careful with what you're doing, but I can definitely say that with a honing guide, it does not require as much attention as freehand sharpening will. Okay, so take the water off. You can see what we've done. We've removed the material from the front part of that bevel, which is actually a good sign. All right, that means that we are pretty close to the angle we need. Clearly, the back of this bevel here is not at 30 degrees, but this area that we just cleaned up is exactly 30 degrees. Truthfully, we don't need this to be 30 degrees just yet. So I don't feel the need to do anything else with that. I just want to make sure that I get to be 30 degrees between, here and the very tip. Okay? So I'll give it a little bit more time, and we'll get pretty close. All right, that is right up to the edge. Now, interestingly enough, you can't see it because it's got a very fine micro bevel on there, but at the very tip, there's about a 1/16 of an inch line all the way across because I did create a micro bevel with this one. I sharpened at 30 to establish the primary bevel, and then the secondary micro bevel is sharpened just a couple degrees more than that, all right? So again, we're using our imaginations here. So I'm actually just gonna remove my micro bevel just to make it simple. As if this were a borrowed chisel or a hand-me-down or a 25-degree factory chisel. Okay. All right, I feel the bevel on the back. We are right up to the edge. All right. So here's the thing. I'm really only concerned about the micro bevel at this point. Now, granted, I did just sharpen this with 220 grit. So if you want to, if you want to be a little bit picky about it, we could take it to the 1000 grit and sharpen up that primary bevel, 30-degree bevel, just to smooth it out a little bit. But here's the thing. Once I put that micro bevel on there, that primary bevel doesn't really matter as much. So I don't feel the need to polish that up to 8000. 1000 will get it pretty darn nice. Okay, so I've just cleaned that up with 1000. I don't know, man, that's looking pretty good. So here's the idea. Remember I said that this thing has the built-in micro bevel adjustment. So I'm going to turn this knob downward. What that does is adjust the roller. It's on a cam. All right, so the roller now is sitting down lower than it was before, which effectively raises the back of the chisel and means that I'm just by a couple degrees working at the very tip now. So what I'm going to do is start with my 1000 grit, and watch how fast this goes. This is a very quick process. Now be careful when you're first working that very tip of the edge, because it can be easy to gouge a water stone if you're not careful. So just light to moderate pressure. Okay, feel the back. You should start to feel a real substantial bevel now that you're working right at that tip. And I hope you can make this out on the live cam here. I'll move it, hopefully the light will catch it. Look at the very tip. You should start to see about just over a 1/16 of an inch line right at the tip there. All right, that is the micro bevel that we're establishing. That is the business end, so that when we come back to resharpen this chisel a month from now, we know the exact setting we can get to hit that micro bevel perfectly. Okay, but we're only at 1000 grit right now, so let's go ahead and move to 5000. You can certainly spend a little bit more time on each stone if you choose to. It's also a good idea to spray. You'll notice I do this in between. I spray everything with water to get the lower grit off of the roller and off of the chisel. I don't want to carry that low grit with me. Now, every time you're approaching a stone, you have to be careful with the roller. You don't want the roller to go over the edge or tip over the side, but you still want to make an effort to try to wear the entire surface evenly. So you'll notice I kind of do a little back and forth, angling one way, then angle the other way, back the other way, maybe flip the whole stone around. Okay? It's looking good. Clean it up. Move to 8000. And now we are putting a beautiful polish at 8000 grit. Okay, once again, I will try to see if you can't catch that angle just right. All right, that micro bevel just a couple degrees more than 30, so you're looking at what, I don't know, what, 31, 32, does anybody know what the Mk2's micro bevel is? It can't be more than like 2 degrees, right? All right, so that is now polished to 8,000. So I still have a little bit of a burr, and we need to take care of that, so let me loosen the chisel. We can now remove it carefully. 8,000 grit, because that was the last thing I touched my flat back with, right? So we want to just touch it up to remove the burr that we created from sharpening the bevel. Nice light touch. And you'll notice, especially when you're doing something that's perfectly flat like the back on a very fine grit stone, the water tends to really pull that chisel in. I mean, I'm not even holding that. Well, you can see it eventually will break. But the, what is that? Cohesion or adhesion? I can never remember. Anyway, you can see it really sucks it in and holds it in place. So you don't have to do much work other than move it back and forth. And then when you remove it, don't lift the handle up, because that puts the sharp edge down into the stone. That's a bad idea. Push down on the handle and break the suction. And that'll make sure that your bevel is intact and unharmed. All right, and now we have beautiful micro bevel ready to roll. Okay, and that again was sort of simulating a chisel that was given to us by someone, or a brand new chisel that we now have at our perfect 30 degrees. Now remember, I also mentioned not removing more material than we need to. That's basically what I was talking about when I didn't reestablish the entire bevel. If I took this chisel over to my grinder and said I want to put the entire bevel at 30 degrees or 35 degrees, I'd have to remove quite a bit of material to get there. I'd rather not do that if I don't have to. So I'm only going to remove as much material as is necessary to get the business end of this chisel to do exactly what I want it to do. And I'll worry about this later. Eventually, after a couple years of sharpening, we'll work our way back. There's no rush to get there. All right, but the real business end of the bevel is right at the tip. And that's why a micro bevel, is as useful as it is. Very handy. All right, so in a nutshell, that's my sharpening system. The Sharpen stones in the 3 grits, the Dmt Sharpening Plate, and the Veritas Mk2 Honing Guide. The one thing I do want to show you before I go to answer questions is how delicious our water is here. Typically, when it's time to flatten these stones, what I like to do is go out to the hose. It's just much easier to do outside because it kind of makes a real big mess, and I like to be able to clean the stones off completely before moving to the next stone. I don't want to contaminate one stone with the grit from another. So basically what I do is take my DMT stone, I lay it down flat on the table, make sure it's nice and wet, soak it with the hose, and then I take my stones, drop them on the surface, and remember I was talking about how the chisel, the flat end of the chisel sucks down to the surface. Well, the same thing really happens with your stones. So you can just push them forward and back, and nice long strokes like this. And you see I like to angle it one way and the other, just to kind of help promote even wearing. And what will happen is, let's break the suction. All right, let me spray it. You'll see that there is a little bit of a dark spot right there, but everything else is nice and clean looking. Well, that dark spot represents a low spot. That's a spot that needs to be flattened a little bit more. So I will keep working this back and forth until there is no more dark spots. So there are no more dark spots. Sometimes you got to put a little muscle into it. All right, and that is now perfectly clean. That's what you're going for. Now the thing is, with water stones, you really want to do this after every sharpening session. If you've got a ton of sharpening to do, you may have to do it in between, while you're in the middle of a sharpening session, just to make sure that your stones are staying flat. Your finer stones will wear quicker, so if you have your 8,000 and 5,000 and you're doing a lot of polishing, you're probably going to want to have a couple of flattening sessions during a single sharpening session if you're using it a lot. So how much? I mean, it kind of just depends. Generally speaking, I'll sharpen my whole set of chisels What do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 chisels. I'll sharpen them all in one session and then flatten at the end when I'm done. Kind of like we're doing right now. So, one chisel sharpening like that, I don't know if I would flatten after just doing one with touch-up. You can if you want to. But that's really, for the most part, that's about it for my system. Now again, I didn't really want to, pretend that this was a full-scale sharpening thing. I do plan to do a full sharpening video in the future on the Wood Whisperer site. So we'll be able to do that and cover pretty much all the other types of sharpening that are out there, a little bit more detail about the bevel and the flattening of the back. But for this, I really just wanted to put it out there so people know exactly what materials, what tools, what brands I use to do my stuff, and I find the easiest. Doesn't mean that the other stuff doesn't work, because I know there's probably, most of the people in the chat room right now probably use different methods to get the same results. That's perfectly fine. It is what it is, yo. So I'm going to go to the chat room, see if there's any questions. What kind of Japanese chisels do I use? I use a brand called Fuji Euro from Hida Tool. If anybody can put the link up in the chat room for me, HIDA Tool. I think it's hidatool.com. They have a lot of Japanese woodworking tools and cutlery and things like that. And the particular brand or the family that I have for mine is Fuji Hiro, F-U-J-I-H-I-R-O. Pricey, for sure. Would using cheap stones yield better results than a scary sharp sandpaper method? I don't think so, Robo Dude. Scary sharp can produce pretty darn good results. Granted, you're limited by how fine of a sandpaper you can get to, but I know, in terms of just getting a good sharp chisel for woodworking stuff, I don't know that you can really, you can do equally well with both systems personally. If it's a super cheap waterstone, I don't know. I mean, I haven't really worked much with really cheap waterstones. In the beginning, I think I bought a fairly cheap one from Rockler. I didn't get good results with it, but it wasn't because of the stone. It was more because of how I was using it, and I didn't know much about it. But again, any sharpening medium, the thing I find with sharpening is it's actually more important that you stick with one thing, you learn it, and you get good at it. Because if you keep trying a bunch of different things, you'll never get good at any of them. And they're all capable of producing a good utility edge that can get the job done in the shop. So it kind of depends on your budget and what type of thing interests you. Personally, I think waterstones have more longevity in the shop. I don't want to buy sandpaper constantly. Sticking the sandpaper down to a surface is kind of a pain in the butt. But it is, cost of entry, is much cheaper. How hard is it to go from the factory degree up to, let's say, well, yeah, I think Shannon answered the question perfectly. Don't try and go from 25 or 20 to 40 in one shot. There's no reason to. That's what I was explaining about the grinder. If you wanted to reset the bevel, you could take it to a slow grinder and you could put it at 40 degrees or 45 degrees, whatever you want. But there's really no reason. There's no rush to take it right to 45 degrees. You could slowly get there over time, just working the front of the bevel, and eventually you will get there. But there's just no reason to remove that much metal just so that the entire primary bevel is at 40 degrees. So just take your time to get there slowly. If you use a grinder, to answer your question, how fast? Seconds. If you got a good grinder, you can just sparks later, got yourself 40 degrees. Yeah, I'm not too fond of I've got a pretty fine stone on a Delta variable speed grinder over there. Frankly, I don't use it for much, especially for my woodworking tools. I don't, just because of this method that I use of worrying about just the tip of the bevel, I just don't really find a need to grind tool edges very much. I do have a jet wet sharpener. That's kind of the exception in the grinding world because it's a wet grinding stone and it's a much slower grinding. It doesn't heat up as much. It's much safer. If I really had it, if I dropped this chisel on the concrete and needed to fix it, I might take it to my jet at that point. It will still take a while to clean up that edge, but it'll be a little bit faster than doing it on the stones here. So I would use that to get back to square one and then go back to my stones. but I wouldn't, I got that years ago, and I, thought it would answer all of my problems for sharpening. And it's good, and it certainly can be your only sharpening system, but for me personally, I just kept gravitating back to the stones. What happens if you sharpen back to the hollows of the Japanese chisels? Well, you probably will need to flatten the back a little bit more. See if you, where's the camera angle here? You see where those hollows are? The way to get those hollows back is to remove more material from the back of the chisel. The flat of the chisel will expose more flat surface. So if you start to get too close, you just do a little bit more heavy duty work on the flat of the chisel, and that should sort of give you a little bit more room to do all of your sharpening. So as you work that bevel, 10 years from now, you keep working that bevel and it works back to the very tip. That's when you're going to have to do a little bit more effort on the bottom of the chisel, the back of the chisel, to help you get a little bit more surface area. But the truth is, for folks like us, I would say the vast majority of us get a couple, well, I say us, but I get more shop time than most people. But even for me, with regular chisel use and my style of woodworking, it's going to take me a damn long time before I approach the hollows of my chisel. Do I ever strop? I do not. I just never really, I don't have anything against it. I think it's pretty effective, and especially if you use like a wet sharpening system, you can only get to a certain grit, and that's based on how you grade the stone. Okay, they usually have that rough and the fine grit. So the other side of those wet sharpening systems is a circular strop that you could put honing compound on. And I mean, the thing is, that is a very good way to put a super sharp edge on a chisel that hasn't necessarily been taken to the highest grit possible. So you know how I sharpened the secondary bevel here, and I really only focused on that very little tip at the fine grit? I didn't sharpen the entire bevel to 8,000 grit, the entire primary bevel, because you don't need to. The same thing applies over there on a system like that. If you have the bevel mostly sharp and relatively smooth at whatever degree you want, you could then go to a strop and just hit that secondary bevel at that really high grit and then just get a razor sharp edge from it. So it's perfectly legitimate. I just don't really do it myself.